happened is in 2008, I did a trio record with Ben Monder and
Hmm.
Daniel Lumer,
Yeah.
and we did it in France. And it's a record called I Will Follow You, and it's basically freer music that I wrote thinking there would be no bass and kind of thinking of the way Danielle plays drums now. So I wrote some music specifically for that record. And when the record came out, this thought occurred to try to do some kind of record release thing in New York, but I wasn't really gonna be able to fly Danielle over. That was just kind of too involved and too expensive and not really realistic.
Yeah.
So I got together with Ben on the phone and I was like, "Hey man, who do we call?" And I started kind of thinking about different people. I remember thinking about Tom Rainey and Nasheed Waits and Taishan Sore and other great drummers who I wanted to play with and who I thought would be great for this music. And then Ben was like, "Hey, why don't you call Paul Motian?" And I was like, "Can I do that? Like, can I actually do that?" So he said, "Yeah." Uh, and he gave me Paul's phone number and he was like, "Okay, so call him, tell him I gave you the number. It's going to cost you, X amount of money because that's what he
Yeah.
charged." And but I was kind of ready for it, so I called Paul Motion, and he picked up the phone, and I hired him for a gig, and then he ended up really liking the gig. And what happened is maybe 2 or 3 months later, he was playing at the Vanguard maybe 6 times a year. He
Yeah.
wasn't traveling anymore, but he was playing a lot at the Vanguard. And a week opened up. Maybe Lorraine Gordon gave him a week that he wasn't supposed to have because somebody canceled, or maybe he had a week and somebody canceled on him.
Mm.
I'm not really sure what happened, but it turned out that there was a week that he had at the Vanguard and he wasn't sure what to do. And at that point, one of his friends, photographer John Rogers, had seen him after my gig, which was at Cornelia Street Cafe when I hired Paul and Ben. And John, even though he wasn't at that gig, spent some time hanging out with Paul Motion after the gig, and Paul apparently told John how much he enjoyed the gig. So
Mm.
they were talking months later. This is John telling me this, like I wasn't there, but and Paul said to John, "Oh, I have this week at the Vanguard. I don't know what I'm gonna do." And John said, "Hey man, why don't you hire this sax player that you told me about that you really dug at Cornelia Street?" And apparently Paul said, "Yo, this is a great idea. I'm going to do that." And so
That's so cool.
I owed his gig to John Rogers apparently because Paul picked up his phone, called Ben. Ben called me and said Paul was going to call me, and Paul called and he said he had to run it by Lorraine Gordon, and Lorraine said yes. And so we did a week at the Vanguard,
It's
and he
beautiful.
called it Paul Motion New Trio, which was, a bit of pressure, but yeah, I mean that was definitely a dream week for me. There was like a for me as a musician, there was like a before and an after that
Yeah.
week.
Did you play his tunes or did you improvise or like?
We played a mix of his tunes, my tunes, and standards.
Oh, beautiful.
Because the gig that I hired him for, we were playing my music and standards. And then when we did the week at the Vanguard, he just said, "Let's do the same thing. I like your tunes." And he also said, "Learn some of my tunes."
Yeah.
And then I was like, "Well, which ones?" Because, there's a lot. And he wrote a lot of great music. So,
Yeah.
and he was like, "Oh, just get together with Ben. He has my book and you guys figure it out." So I went over to Ben's, we played through a bunch of stuff, we picked a bunch, and the first day on a Tuesday we showed up with a list of like Paul's tunes and some of my tunes and some standards, and we just gave him the list, and he looked at the list and he took a piece of paper and a pen and wrote out his own list taking from the first list, and those were the sets, and that was it.
Beautiful. Man.
No rehearsal, uh,
Sure.
a 5 minute sound check, and then it was boom, first night, 8 p.m. on Tuesday.
Oh, fantastic. Man. Well, was any of that recorded? I mean, did anyone record it or?
Not officially, but I snuck in something, so I
Oh
have some
man.
of it, and
Oh,
other people snuck in stuff, and then they send it to me. So I have some of that on my computer.
oh
Yeah.
man. One day, if you want to share just for my ears, I would love to hear that, man.
Yeah, I actually haven't revisited this in a long time, but I would like to hear it, and maybe one day it'll
Yeah,
see the light of day in
yeah,
some way, shape, or form. But yeah, it's good that I have this. It's an incredible memory for me, and just the level of and intensity of music making, particularly from him,
mm,
was really, something uh that I remember very well, that I can still kind of feel, and that I haven't um experienced many times. It's like I've
sure.
experienced that with Paul, with Al Foster, uh and then, with people closer to my generation. I did a tour with Jeff Ballard where,
Mm.
there was some of that same kind of like intensity and just 100% commitment to the music.